on.
This is Channel 10 News, where we're all about rights all the time. I'm Becky Finn, and we're returning to our live coverage on this 20th day of the Virginia Ratifying Convention. For our viewers just joining us, this convention follows the event that took place across the Confederation of States last year. You may recall that last summer, between May and September, representatives from 12 of the 13 states convened in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The stated purpose of this meeting was to rework the Articles of Confederation, which currently govern us. But after 3 months of conversations, this new document, the Constitution of the United States, has been published and disseminated amongst the states for ratification. Here in Virginia, at the beginning of June, the ratifying convention began. James Madison and George Mason have been two of the top speakers in Williamsburg. Reporting to you live from Montpelier, we've got Sarah Lee Hall, who will brief us on James Madison's perspective. Hello, Sarah Lee. Tell us a little bit about how James Madison feels about the Constitution and this convention.
Thank you so much, Becky. Obviously, Mr. Madison is extremely excited and anxious to get this Constitution ratified. His main concern is that this be done speedily and as efficiently as possible. That brings us to the great arguments that they're seeing right now at the Virginia ratification.
Thanks for that introduction, Sarah Lee. We've also got Lacey Villava joining us live from Gunston Hall, who will tell us more about George Mason's side of things. Lacey?
Good morning, Becky. I'm so excited to be here on the grounds of Gunston Hall today. Right here where George Mason was thinking about the Virginia Declaration of Rights almost 10 years ago. And, you know, he's just really focused on making sure that this Constitution protects the rights of the people as much as possible. George Mason is really concerned about things that aren't quite right with the Constitution and doesn't want it to be ratified before it is really 100% ready to go.
Thanks, Lacey. While we have you, tell us a little more specifically about the challenges George Mason sees in the Constitution.
Absolutely. So George Mason's biggest concern, of course, is that there is no Bill of Rights to the Constitution. He says that there's no Declaration of Rights and that the laws of the government are really going to be paramount to the laws and Constitution of the several states. He thinks that each individual state's Bill of Rights is going to protect the citizens of the state, but not necessarily protect the citizens of the country. And he says that when such amendments are added, that he will most heartily make the greatest of concessions and put his hand to this government.
And Sarah Lee, how has James Madison been responding to these claims?
Well, as graciously as he possibly can, Becky, but Madison's very concerned with this kind of attitude. I have a quote from him about this. He said, "The powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite." So essentially what Madison's saying is, we don't need to worry about this right now. The federal government cannot supersede what these states' rights already have. And one of his biggest concerns, Becky, is that if we start listing what our rights are, anything that is left out is inherently going to be considered not a right. And we better hope we don't make any mistakes there.
So clearly there's quite a bit of tension between the two gentlemen on this topic. As our viewers may recall, George Mason wrote the initial draft of the Virginia Declaration of Rights more than 10 years ago. But this is not the only topic our two founders don't agree upon. The vice presidency is also a tense subject. Sarah, tell us a little bit about what James Madison has said about that.
Yes, and a lot of what's said about this is just going to be the result of so much back and forthing that happened back at the original convention in Philadelphia. And essentially Madison saying, all right, if there are two representatives of the Senate, members of Senate per state, there's inevitably going to be potential moments where there's a tie in making any decisions. And Madison's solution to this says, fine, give it to the vice president to break the tie. He doesn't see that there's any issue of overreach between branches. The branches are all there to check and balance each other, and he doesn't really see what the problem is here. But a lot of people do seem to have some issues with this, for sure.
Lacey, what are George Mason's feelings about the vice presidency?
Well, George Mason has some really strong feelings about this. He is incredibly concerned about the vice presidency. Like the Bill of Rights, he thinks that what James Madison has said and put forward in the initial Constitution is a milk and water proposition. It's not very strong. It's not going to save us in the future if something does go wrong. He thinks, and to quote George Mason directly, he thinks that the vice president is not only unnecessary, but a dangerous officer. It is creating an unusual and dangerous mix between the legislative and the executive branches of government, which in the end are likely not to protect the people.
George Mason obviously feels that much more work needs to be done on the Constitution before the states ratify it. Can you tell us a little bit more about how specifically he feels?
Absolutely. George Mason 100% thinks that we need another convention. He is incredibly concerned, and in Philadelphia last year, right at the end of the convention in September, he stated that we did in fact need another convention, specifically in order to be able to put these ideas forward to the people so that they could have a say in the government that ultimately would be ruling them. He was really, really concerned that this government had not, in fact, been a part of the people's decision. So he has issues with the vice presidency, obviously, with the lack of the Bill of Rights, and there's so much more that he thinks we need to really nail down and make certain that we have support from both the people and their representatives in order to make this document really a useful one.
Sarah Lee, any final words?
Absolutely. The cool thing about James Madison is when you hear him talk, obviously he is cognizant of these very real concerns that people have. What he's also so aware of and hyper aware of is how difficult it is to get this many people to agree on any one thing. His experience of it, and as George Mason could have seen in the Philadelphia Convention, was so dramatic. I can't believe any of them made it out of there alive. And his concern is if we immediately start holding yet another convention before this Constitution has already even been given a chance, not only is it going to be difficult to get even more people to agree on any of these systems of laws, but it's also going to prove that the suggestions that are going to come out of this immediate next convention are going to be wildly with no basis. It's going to be guesses that people have, what might happen before we've even seen this Constitution in action to see what it could do. Madison, contrary to popular belief, is not against another convention eventually. What he wants to see is a chance for this Constitution to be enacted, to see what it can actually do in practice. And then perhaps if another convention may be held someday in the future, some legitimate amendments would be proposed because we would have gotten a chance to see what worked and what didn't. And again, Madison is so concerned with time. You give this any longer for these men to sit and think about what they would personally want to see happen, and we're going to see the dissolving of this American experiment before it even gets a chance to stand on its own 2 feet, and that's his main concern.
Well, there you have it. The debate continues at the Virginia Ratifying Convention. We'll continue to bring you live coverage of how this event unfolds right here from News Team 10, where it's all rights all the time.
And cut. All right, let's answer some questions from the viewers. Lacey, do you want to take it away?
Sure. Did we have any questions that came through, Becky?
We do. Lacey, this question is for you. What were some of the other reasons George Mason didn't sign the Constitution?
That's a great question. So George Mason didn't sign the Constitution for a huge number of reasons. The Bill of Rights was the biggest one. But of course, the fact that there was a vice president that didn't work out, that we have no address to the concept of the slave trade. For 20 years, he thinks that's a big problem that the Constitution had. He wanted a triumvirate as the executive branch, so 3 men instead of just the single president. He's got a lot of things, and you can absolutely read through those in his objections to the Constitution here on site at Gunston Hall and on our website.
Okay, great. We have a follow-up question to that. When was the Bill of Rights actually added?
So I know the final date. Sarah Lee, do you remember when the Bill of Rights was initially proposed?
Oh, as in which version?
That's true too. That's a great question. For those of you who don't know, there were 12 bills initially added, proposed to be the first amendments to the Constitution. And as I recall, James Madison did that initial proposal.
He did, 89.
Yeah, in 1789, and it took some time. George Mason actually got a copy of that Bill of Rights, and he said in a letter to a friend at that point he could cheerfully put his hand and heart to this government. But it wasn't until December 15th, 1791 that 10 of those 12 Bills of Rights actually went into being.
And bonus follow-up, an 11th one of those original 12 was eventually ratified in 92, I believe.
Yeah.
1992.
As I recall, it was under Bill Clinton, and this one's really interesting to me. It's that the current Congress cannot raise their own pay. They can raise the pay of the subsequent Congress. So those people in office today can agree on a pay raise for Congress, but it doesn't take effect until the next Congress sits.
That was actually originally a brainchild of James Madison, where he was concerned about Congress being able to determine their own pay. We ratified it as a nation as the 27th Amendment in 1992. However, when it was originally proposed in 1789 by James Madison, Madison's concern was that they would lower their pay. His concern there was that they would lower their pay, and therefore only independently wealthy people could afford to serve as representatives. And he was very concerned by this. And I just find it a fun factoid that we did ratify it that much later, but the concern had completely swapped to worrying that Congress would raise their own pay.
And I think it was only like 1 or 2 states left to ratify. Like it was sitting out there from 1791 until 1992, and it only needed 1 more state to do it.
And that was, I believe that was brought to the attention of the modern Congress by a 19-year-old college student in Texas. So if you can vote,
I didn't know that. That's really cool.
Yeah, he was doing a project for his class about the American government, and I believe he got a C- on that paper. And he said, you know what? I did my research, and I really believe that Madison's original proposed amendment could still be ratified. Contacted his representative, and that's all she wrote.
That's awesome.
All right, we have a couple more questions. Were there other rights omitted that we didn't hear about in the first few drafts?
So in what eventually ended up in the Constitution, there's a clause in one of the amendments that says all of these rights plus many, many more that we have not named do belong to the people. So we have explicitly named some of those subsequently, but there are tons of things. George Mason's original Virginia Declaration of Rights included 16 clauses, some of which were rights, some of which had to do with the structure of the government in order to protect those rights. And most of what George Mason included in the original Declaration of Rights did also make it into the Bill of Rights. The one big change between the two is that James Madison included freedom of speech, and George Mason included freedom of the press. And there's just a really fine line between the two. Freedom of speech has obviously a lot to do with how we talk and interact with one another. Freedom of the press, if you didn't get to see our Declaration Day program on June 12th, that's all about the definition of freedom of the press and why we think George Mason included that in his document, because there was a lot of persecution for publishers of newspapers in particular, for what at the time was called seditious libel.
And something to think about and bear in mind with that as well is that at one point, I believe there was something like 200 proposed amendments that had to be whittled down. And again, remember Madison's concern is time. He's concerned with everybody being able to agree. So a lot of the general language that's in the Bill of Rights is part of that attempt to make everybody happy. So, you know, there are things we debate constantly. We won't go into it today, but the Second Amendment is one that it's talking about interpretation of the language. Well, to be frank with you, a lot of states had their own version of a right to bear arms, and they all meant something different. So they use this general language to make everybody happy, and as a result, it kicked the can down the road, and it's still something we talk about. So that is
absolutely.
But also, in those first few drafts, one of my favorite proposed amendments had to do with the color of a Supreme Justice's robes. I'm not even kidding. I'm glad we left that one out. But yeah, everybody had ideas.
Absolutely.
All right, we have another question. Did Madison and Mason generally get along outside of politics?
Sarah Lee, you want to take this one?
I would love to. Madison and Mason are some of my favorite people to study because of their ability to compartmentalize what they enjoy about someone and what they don't. And outside of politics, you have to remember there's a huge age difference between these men. And Mason was already, I believe we said he was on his, it's a terrible way to put it.
He was on his second marriage, and he had 12 kids, 9 of whom were still alive at this point, ranging in age from about 18 to 35.
Yeah, and his experiences are more lived experiences. And that's where a lot of his wisdom comes, is from just experiencing life. Madison is much younger. He is about 36 at this point. He is single. He has a very weak constitution, terrible pun there. He gets sick a lot. He does not have many lived experiences in the way that Mason does. His strengths lie more in his supreme formal education, his exposure to philosophies from all over the world. And so on the face of things, they don't seem to have a lot in common. However, they're both Virginia planters, and they both have this common goal of perpetuity. What will what they do today, how will what they do today affect tomorrow? And can they make something that lasts? So how you do something matters. They sometimes differ on what that looks like, but they have this very shared vision. And I think they really enjoy that about one another. I really do.
Absolutely. One of the quotes that Mason left to us in documentary evidence is that he's thinking about the as yet unborn millions. And I get goosebumps every time I think about that phrase, because that's all of us today. And Madison and Mason may not have agreed with one another. They may not agree with the conversations that we're having today, but we're having them because they had the foresight to think about the generations to come.
Absolutely.
Great. All right. Last question. Who were some of the people who sided with each of these two men?
Great question. And it depends on whether or not we're talking Constitutional Convention, the ratifying convention, which we're talking about today. and everything in between, because it waffles and it depends on which particular subject we're talking about, because there are some things ultimately that Madison and Mason agree upon, and there are some things that they adamantly don't. Edmund Randolph and George Mason did not seem to be particularly friendly at the Constitutional Convention in 1787. But that moment where George Mason is talking about the vice presidency at the ratifying convention in 1788, he's actually seconding a motion made by Edmund Randolph. Patrick Henry and Mason seem to be in cahoots about quite a bit during the ratification convention. And you may also remember that ultimately Patrick Henry decided not to go to the Constitutional Convention because he smelt a rat. Let's see, one more. Who else is a good one for Mason? Elbridge Gerry at the Constitutional Convention in 1787 is another good one for Mason. They both agree that a Bill of Rights needs to be added to the Constitution, and there are 3 people present at the Constitutional Convention who don't sign: Edmund Randolph, Elbridge Gerry, and George Mason. Elbridge Gerry and Mason for very similar reasons, and they both wrote objections to the Constitution that seem to be fairly similar. And this is my interpretation, but I think Edmund Randolph went off in a bit of a huff because the Virginia plan that he proposed was not accepted. How about for Madison?
So Madison has, you know, and something to bear in mind when we talk about all of this is sometimes we're gazing at this through 21st century eyes. Do recall, we don't have political defined parties that we think of today. When we talk about Federalists and Anti-Federalists, we're not talking about political alliances. Anti-Federalist is such a huge scope. Patrick Henry and George Mason are both concerned with the Constitution as it is, but it takes very little meddling to make Mason much happier. Henry is still adamantly against its even existence.
So opposed.
So there's such a huge range. As a result, there are seemingly more numerous anti-federalists than there are federalists. However, you have to remember that the ones who are federalists, who are on Madison's side for just getting this Constitution ratified, are pretty big guns. George Washington, the arguably only unifying element to all of the different states because of his leadership in the Revolutionary War, he's quiet and he's gracious, but he is also throwing his weight behind ratifying this Constitution, and that is not a little thing.
He was also the president of the Constitutional Convention, so that was a huge part of not only his reputation, but he's throwing his weight personally, professionally behind this document.
And you have to be like, if you're you know, a farmer out in the middle of nowhere, it's not like you're hearing about this directly very well. A lot of the things that you're hearing about these conventions are word of mouth. You're trying to get in, you're trying to get more information. If you're lucky enough, you got a copy of the Federalist Papers to give a skim through and see what the arguments are for ratifying this thing. But a lot of the time, it's going to be your heroes throwing their names with it, and that will carry a lot of weight. Of course, you have Thomas Jefferson's a funny one. He
goes both ways.
He goes both ways. That's because Jefferson will never stop tweaking anything. He is adamantly for the Constitution being ratified quickly. He's just also advocating these other things happening as well. He also thinks the Bill of Rights is a very good idea. It's just not going to stop him from saying, let's go forward, we'll add that later. So you have some pretty big guns there. And at the Virginia ratifying convention specifically, those are some pretty big voices for sure.
Mm-hmm. One fun fact is it's either the father-in-law or the son-in-law, son who married one of Mason's daughters is at the Constitutional Convention and votes Constitutional ratifying convention and votes opposite from Mason. I want to know what was going on at those family dinners.
There's a lot of those. There's all kinds of stories of somebody voting for the Constitution, in favor of the Constitution, because he really hated the speech Elbridge Gerry stood up and gave. And he was like, well, I was on the fence, but that guy's annoying, so I'm gonna vote for it. So
Exactly.
that, I mean, it legitimately happened.
Well, we need to wrap up for the day. Sarah Lee, are there any programs, anything that you want to share about that's going on at Montpelier coming up in the near future?
I would really absolutely love to. Montpelier has a lot of plans for upcoming events. One that I really recommend is, if you have not already subscribed to the archaeology newsletter that we have here, we do have an archaeology lab, and we do social distancing archaeological digs with the public. So you can actually email us at dig, at montpelier.org and get information on how to do social distancing digs in 2021. We also have some really cool programs coming up. We have walking tours that we are doing outside on the grounds. Our grounds are rather huge, and the best part about these walking tours is you're getting one-on-one tours with some of our specialist historians and archaeologists that don't normally give tours. It's a really super special experience. Some virtual events, Constitution 101, we have book talks, specialty house tours, you name it. Just hop onto the James Madison Montpelier website and you will see all kinds of things. Thank you.
It's been so long since I visited Montpelier. I desperately need to come down and do some of these things. It sounds amazing.
Vice versa. It's been a minute since I've been to Gunston Hall, and it is so beautiful there.
Well, thank you. So I'm super excited to tell you about what we've got coming up this fall. We are open. Montpelier and Gunston Hall are both open for some sort of in-person experience. We are very excited. We have construction going on in the mansion right now, but we should be getting the mansion back and refurnishing it in the next couple of weeks. We will be announcing that online when that happens. So keep an eye on our social media and on our mailing list for that information. And I'm also excited that we have a number of virtual programs coming up over the next few months, including next month we are doing a bunch of food themed programming, history in the kitchen for the young people in your life. We're exploring a historic recipe with you and that young person for 30 minutes. And we've got a cocktail program coming up in October as well. And then in December, we will be exploring Bill of Rights Day on December 15th. All of our programs are free of charge. And I don't know if that's the case with you at Montpelier or not, Sarah Lee.
Most of them are. We do have some specialty classes, some book talks, some Constitution 101 classes do cost, and the walking tours do as well. But we have lots of free activities as well, and you'll see that at the website.
And that same thing with us, we have some costs for our in-person tours. There is a fee for the grounds usage, a fee for the walking tours that we're doing. But we do ask on behalf of both Montpelier and Gunston Hall, if you are enjoying what we're doing, please donate to support all of our programs. And we invite you to become members of Montpelier or Gunston Hall as you find that fits with your schedule. We look forward to seeing you in the future, and we will be monitoring any other questions that come up on the comments here on our social media page for the rest of the day. And you can always send us comments, thoughts here at Gunston Hall at historic@gunstonhall.org. If you have any directed for Montpelier, we can also forward those along. And we look forward to seeing you at our programs in the future. Lastly, this program is being recorded. It will be archived here on Facebook. We will also be posting it on our website very soon, and Montpelier will make it available as well, I believe. So thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you soon.